Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Bridget Colling. I'm the Director of Content Strategy at C3, and this is the third in our Diversity and Inclusion series of webinars. And today we are very, very lucky to be talking with Chicago ROAR, that's Chicago Regional Organizing for Anti-Racism. They do fantastic trainings around anti-racism for organizations of all shapes and sizes, and we're really lucky to have them here with us today. A few housekeeping things quickly. So we really encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. You can put them in the questions field in your control panel. And as they come in, I'll be fielding them to Joy and Derrick and have them answer them throughout the presentation. We'll also pause and stop a few times during the presentation so you can raise more questions then as well. And other than that, I think we're totally clear. So we'll have a few more people joining us, but thank you all of you who are here already. I'm going to turn it over to Joy and Derrick to tell you a little more about themselves and get us started on the presentation.
Thank you, Bridget.
Absolutely.
My name is Derrick Dawson. I am, along with Joy, the co-program coordinator for Chicago ROAR. And let me say a little bit about Chicago ROAR for those who are not familiar. Chicago ROAR is a local program of an organization called Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training. Crossroads is a national organization that does institutional anti-racism training throughout the country. It was begun in around 1986. It grew out of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, the ELCA, by some Lutheran pastors who wanted to address racism in institutions, particularly in their church. Over the years, the organization grew to do work in all kinds of organizations outside of the church, and the name then changed to become Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training from what had been Crossroads Ministries. And the Lutheran pastors developed Crossroads out of community organizing. It started in Chicago, and they were very familiar with community organizing as it existed in Chicago. But these pastors decided that it might be very helpful, alongside with the kind of outside organizing that was done, to develop a system of inside organizing by people who were inside of organizations, who worked for them, who loved them, and had committed to their lives to those organizations, and begin making change from the inside. And Crossroads has grown out of that, and that remains Crossroads' mission today. About 4 years ago, Crossroads decided that since we had such an institutional presence in Chicago, to start a local partner program in Chicago, and that's where Chicago Organizing for Anti-Racism came from. So we are Chicago ROAR doing local organizing work.
Joy, I'm hearing a little feedback from your microphone. If you could mute it.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. There we go. Okay, go ahead, Derrick.
Okay, thank you. So I am, along with Joy, the co-program coordinator of Chicago ROAR. I am from Chicago. I grew up on the south side of Chicago and came to the organization through my church, which is the Episcopal Church in the Episcopal Diocese of Chicago. I was introduced to Crossroads training through that organization and became more and more involved over the years. Started working part-time and became an organizer trainer on a volunteer basis. And about 2 years ago, after working for about 20 years in a corporate law firm, left the firm to join Chicago ROAR full-time as the co-program coordinator. And I will let Joy introduce herself. Joy?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Joy, and I am, as Derrick said, co-program coordinator of Chicago ROAR. I live in Chicago now. I moved here in June of 2014, and before that I lived in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I went to school there and stayed, and I was a high school Spanish teacher, and I am originally from North Dakota, so I've been around in various places. And I got involved in this anti-racism institutional transformation work through my experience with the Kalamazoo Public Schools. I was a high school Spanish teacher, and a group of us teachers were had a chance to attend a Crossroads 2.5-day Understanding and Analyzing Systemic Racism workshop, which we will let you know more about towards the end of the webinar here. But it was transformative for me as a white teacher. It helped me to understand racism at deeper levels, and also to understand the kinds of barriers I was bumping up against in the schools where I worked with, in relating to students and families of color, but also in trying to eliminate the achievement gap, or what we sometimes call opportunity gaps. And so through that work, we built a transformation team, which is one of the things Crossroads does. We build internal teams of people who lead the organization in long-term change. And I was able to be part of a group to build one of those teams and then be on it for several years as a teacher. And for me, it was just a great experience of how do you actually transform an institution, and how do you help an institution live more fully into its values. And so that's what we hope to share with you a little bit more about on this webinar, is just how we do that at Chicago Roar. And we're hoping that you and your various institutions and nonprofits will be able to gain some insight and hopefully some ideas about next steps of moving forward and becoming anti-racist multicultural institutions. Anything else you wanted to add, Derrick, before I move us to the next slide?
I think we're good. Joy, go ahead.
Okay, great. So what we want to start with is what we think about at Crossroads and regionally here in Chicago, Chicago Roar, of 4 approaches to social change. We know that there's all kinds of ways that institutions and others doing change work have their various theories. And we take this piece of 4 approaches from social change from an organization called Movement Strategy Center. So I want to give them credit, and you can Google them and actually find a longer article about their ideas around these 4 approaches. For the sake of our webinar, we're just going to briefly talk about each of the approaches. And what they say at Movement Strategy Center, and what we really agree with as Chicago Roar, is that it really does take all 4 approaches if we're going to have long-term sustainable change. And so these are the things that we feel like we need to include when we're thinking about transformation. The first one is what Movement Strategy Center calls spirit or sustainable practice. And you can read that a little bit there. And basically this is saying that we need to find ways to celebrate the successes along the way, to encourage one another to do individual reflection, but also organizational reflection, to find the cultural and identity work that undergirds the work. If you think about even something like the civil rights movement and how integral the Harlem Renaissance and other poetry and literature and songs and were always included in the margin and the activism of that movement. And in similar ways, as we do institutional transformation, how do we bring in that cultural spirit, sustainable practice? Whatever your cultural values, whatever your ethics or spiritual values may be, how do you think about those, and how do you think about how do they undergird your work? How do they call you back to a place of grounding and sustainability as you do that? The hard work of change. So that's one of the first things to include. The second thing is what we call community organizing. And community organizing is, in a nutshell, of how do you gather a critical mass of people who understand and who share a concern about the things that need to change in the institution. And how do they get together and see themselves as being stronger together, and stronger with numbers, and that more and more folks are saying, the way we're doing things isn't quite working right, and we have some ideas about how to make some change. And there's some shared language, shared understanding. And relationship building is key in community organizing. The next one is what we call a power analysis, that we know that having diverse institutions isn't just about getting colorful faces in our institutions, but that we need to think about where are there power inequities, power imbalances, how is power being misused, even if it's unconscious and unintentional. And that this power analysis helps us to be critical lovers of our institutions, that we love our institutions so much and we want to see them fulfill their missions, that we want to take a critical lens and thinking about how are we not fully living out into our mission. And then finally, the fourth approach to social change is what we would call organizational development. So these often our institutions are really good at this approach. We do visioning exercises, strategic planning, those kinds of things would all be part of organizational development. And what happens if we just do organizational development without a power analysis, for example, there's ways we can change our organization and continue to reproduce the very same inequities that we are hoping to change. So that with a power analysis, with a community organizing, gathering more people, building relationships, and doing the undergirding sustainable practice work, we find that the transformation happens more effectively and more sustainably. So I'm going to just pause there and see if there's any questions. We'll just take a few questions about these four approaches, any that you relate to, that you find yourself doing more, ones that you'd like to learn a little bit more about. Just want to open it up for if anybody has questions or comments at this point.
Yeah,
go ahead and write them in.
Yes, please.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Keep writing your questions in. And one that was asked is, so if they're obviously these all work best when they're together, when you're doing all of them together. But is there one that's more important than another for an organization that's just getting started and might have limited resources?
Well, that's a good question. I think that certainly the power analysis, I mean, it goes so closely intertwined with community organizing, because as you're bringing people together to say, how do we learn together and how do we take an assessment of how we're doing, that's part of the community organizing, is gathering the people. But then the power analysis is often that happens through like workshops or training or reading books or videos, watching videos together. Somehow, how are you learning about what is systemic oppression and systemic racism? How is that applied to your organization? How are you learning about power and how that's being misused? So I do think that those are probably the first steps. And then you can start to say, okay, now given that, how do we start making some organizational structural change? So would you add anything to that, Derrick, or do you have another perspective?
Well, I would add two things. I would say that many times the approach that an organization takes comes out of that organization's history and ethos. So, for instance, with sustainable spiritual practices, many spiritual organizations like churches may naturally approach social justice and social change from a spiritual perspective, because that's just naturally what their perspective is. So it might make sense for them to approach it in that way. But before long, in order for that approach to be successful, all of those other approaches, like Joy said, may need to be integrated along with that. So I don't think there's anything wrong with starting from a particular place, as long as there's an understanding that some element of all four of these approaches need to be incorporated at some point. And I would also say about spiritual practice is that the concept of spiritual practice is also necessary in order to sustain the work. So it's an approach to the work, but it's also very important that the work be undergirded, as Joy mentioned, by some kind of spiritual practice. Most of us who have been involved with social justice work for any period of time know that over time it can be very stressful, and burnout is always an issue, and the work can become very ineffective. So even if a spiritual practice is not necessarily the initial approach, it makes a lot of sense to include some kind of spiritual practice in order to sustain the work and sustain the people who are trying to do the work. And that's why at Crossroads we feel very strongly that spiritual practice needs to be a part of the work, no matter what else is taking precedence at any given time.
Yeah. Thanks, Derrick. And I would just say, too, that for spiritual practice, that's going to look very different in different organizations. And in, like, when I was in the public schools, of course, we're not going to be speaking of, like, religion or spirituality in those kind of contexts. But even still, there's ethical values, there's grounding principles that every organization has. And so that's more of what we mean by this is spiritual and sustainable practice. It can go for secular and religious organizations. Bridget, is there another question or two that you would want to lift up?
None at this time, but I'm sure there'll be more as we keep going.
Awesome. Okay, well, we will keep going then. And so then as we go forward, one of the things that we often say at Chicago Roar is we use an acronym called DDT. Diagnosis determines treatment. And when we say DDT, what we're thinking is that before you do anything about how do you bring diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, racial justice, whatever you call it, to your institution, that there's got to be some kind of shared diagnosis of the problem, some shared language, some shared understanding, and that when you have an in-depth diagnosis, then your treatment is going to be more effective. That so often organizations want to jump to, what do we do, what do we do to fix it? And they want the 10 next steps. And what we say is it doesn't work like that, that getting a deeper and deeper analysis of the problem or diagnosis is what's going to be a very helpful. Otherwise, in our rush to get to a treatment, we will reproduce the very same inequities that we're trying to overcome. And so with that DDT, what we want to do is at least very briefly in this webinar introduce a definition of racism. And before we share with you a definition that we would like you to try on, one that we use, I just want to ask you a question in our poll. And that is, how do you tend to think about racism? And actually, Bridget, if you could go ahead and launch that, you'll see the question and you'll be able to choose your answer. All right, thank you for filling out the poll. I just love these things. So it looks like 27% of you tend to think about racism more as individual and interpersonal, and that 73% of us on the call are thinking of it as institutional or systemic. And I know that probably several of you were like, "Can I pick a both option?" And we didn't give you that. We didn't give you that option, but. So thank you for doing that. And what we would suggest is that that it really is both. That when we're thinking about racism, it does impact us as individuals and interpersonally, but there certainly is a systemic and institutional component. And in fact, in our mainstream society and in much of the news media and other kinds of media where racism comes up as a topic, it tends to focus primarily on individual and interpersonal interactions. Race Forward, an organization who does a lot of work in bringing a racial analysis to the media, has done some research on this, and a high percentage of conversations that are happening in our media are on the individual perspective. And the problem with that is to think about racism as individual alone is that if that's our only diagnosis, then our treatments are very individualistic as well. How do we help fix people's biases? How do we help people get along better? That's where you start to hear things like, well, some of my best friends are of whatever race, fill in the blank. And yet we know that even if we can reduce our own biases, which we think is very important, and we build relationships cross races, which is also very important, we know that there is still racism built into our institutions and systems that need to be addressed. So when we think of a definition of racism, one that we would like to offer to you, is that racism is race prejudice of individuals and of our culture at large, plus the misuse of power by systems and institutions. That's what we're talking about as racism. And what this definition makes very clear in this mathematical equation like this is that race prejudice is not equal to racism. Even though those terms are often used interchangeably, we would suggest that race prejudice is turned into racism when you add this piece around power, and particularly the misuse of power.
Can you explain that a bit more, Joy? I'm interested to know, are there ways that race prejudice shows itself without becoming racism?
Sure, yeah, definitely. So these are the things where where you might hear people using racial slurs or telling racial jokes or um, not liking somebody because of their race. Those more overt expressions are what we might call, overt bigotry. That would could be an individual race prejudice, but also some of the implicit bias that a lot of folks are talking about these days, that often our individual race prejudices are unconscious and we don't even know we have them. And in fact, sometimes our implicit bias is contradictory to our explicit stance on things. I don't know if any of you had a chance to take the Harvard implicit bias test. If you go to their website or Google Harvard implicit bias, you can actually take tests that will help you to see whether or not where your implicit bias is on all kinds of things like race and gender and colorism and all kinds of things. So definitely check that out. So however that plays out, whether it's overt or covert, conscious or unconscious, we would argue that all of us, white people and people of color, we all have racial prejudice in this society. It is impossible not to. We are bombarded with the messages. It's in the air we breathe, if you will. And so there's work that we all have to do to work on those prejudgments and those biases that we learn, but that we learn those messages in our institutions and systems. It's when we go to school, it's when we go to religious institutions, it's when we drive through the neighborhoods and we see segregation and we learn what is a good neighborhood and what is a dangerous neighborhood. Housing, the way housing is structured in our society. All of those societal systems and institutions teach us about racial prejudices. And sometimes we're not even conscious of that happening. And so even if we want to reduce our individual race prejudices, we have to address the systemic component.
And Joy, I am seeing a question in here about how bias is connected. This person's particularly interested in hiring, and they're thinking about blind hiring at their organization, in an attempt to eliminate names or colleges attended or other indicators of race. But it says that there have been mixed results in the effectiveness and fairness of this type of hiring process. And so I don't know if that's getting a little too tactical too early, but I think they would just love to hear your opinion on that kind of thing.
I can definitely touch on that, and also Derrick, feel free to jump in. But yeah, you probably are referring to a recent study, and I don't have the name of it right now, but it just came out even a few weeks ago, or a few months, where an organization did remove all racial indications and names and everything, so that in their hiring practices it was quote unquote colorblind. And what happened is that they still ended up hiring cisgender straight white men. And so that what that study was showing is that it is more important to actually be race informed than race neutral. That we can't be race neutral or colorblind. It's impossible in our society. So that rather than trying to pretend we don't see it or pretend it doesn't matter, how do we be explicit about the ways it does matter, the ways that our institutions have been set up historically and continue today to perpetuate inequities based on race? And that if we're conscious of those ways those biases have gotten in us and name them, and figure out how have we, as our culture of our institutions, saying, oh, well, this is just a cultural fit, or this person, there's all kinds of ways there's racial prejudices built into what we think is a good leader or a good fit for this position. And if we can stop and ask ourselves those critical questions about, how might our thinking this is the best practice or the best way to do this, how is that shaped by race and culture? So we would actually say that the solution isn't to remove those things, but to how do we have explicit conversations and interrogate the ways we're doing hiring practices and the way we're doing interviewing and who is doing them and who's setting up all the policies and where are we searching for candidates. All those questions need to be on the table.
I think another reason that Joy is correct is that blind hiring only addresses the hiring process. And it assumes that once a person is hired, even if the blind process does work to get diverse candidates, it does not address what happens to those people once they become employees. And so it can give a false sense of security that we're hiring more diverse more diverse candidates, but it removes perhaps the responsibility of making sure that those candidates are not treated differently, whether in hidden ways or very overt ways once they become part of the organization. So the reality is that even if blind hiring works in certain circumstances, it does not address how to support and keep those employees and keep a diverse workplace once those people are hired. And so that's another reason that blind hiring can be problematic.
Great. Any other questions before we move to the next slide?
All right, I think we're good to keep moving for now.
Okay, great. Well, then the only other thing I'll just quickly say before we transition is that when we use that word misuse of power, that partly we do that intentionally because we don't think that power in and of itself is a bad thing. That we actually think power for individuals and for institutions is something that we want a little bit more of. The power to be able to do what we say we want to do, to have agency. That's what we mean by power, and that even the power of our educational system or our housing system or our all kinds of nonprofits, whatever areas you're working in, that we want you to have the power to make change and to be able to create, manage, and distribute the resources that you provide that are necessary for life. But that power, when it gets misused, whether that's conscious or unconscious, intentional or unintentional, all of it we would consider to be misuse when race prejudice gets mixed in. So I just wanted to make sure that folks knew that why we added that word of misuse, because we actually think that we're going to need some power in order to make change. And with that, I will turn it to Derrick for the next slide to have us think about, okay, how do you then start to move and make some change in your institution?
Thank you, Joy. So this slide represents a tool that we often use in our organizing, and we call this a continuum on becoming anti-racist multicultural institutions. And that title is very intentional because often in the past, we've had conversations in many of our organizations around how do we become more multicultural. The previous question is often trying to address this in terms of hiring. How do we get, as Joy said, a more colorful organization? We feel it's very important to not only become multicultural, but become an anti-racist multicultural institution. And so this is a tool that we use to address this. And I'm going to ask you, as you're looking at this tool, to think about it from your institution's perspective. Look at this tool as if you're applying it to the organization that you actually work for or work with. And what you'll see is continuing from the left to the right, columns 1 through 6 that start with exclusive and end with.
Sorry to interrupt you, Derrick. I just wanted to let folks know that there is a handout, so that if it's hard to read on your screen, you can click under handouts and it'll show up bigger.
Thank you, Joy. Yes, thank you. So from columns 1 through 6, and 6 being a fully inclusive organization. Now I'm going to talk in more detail about this, but I thought since Joy has let you know how to pull this document up if you want to look at it, to just take a few moments and look through it, and we'll give you some time to do that. Now, as you're looking through, and Joy, I'm going to ask you to help me with these numbers. But as I said, I want you to think about your institution and where it might fall on this continuum. Is your institution exclusive, passive, symbolic change, et cetera, et cetera? Think about your institution and take a look at the continuum again. And we're going to ask for another poll. Joy, can you help me with the numbers?
Yeah, this is Bridget. So we're going to launch a poll. So think about your organization in terms of this continuum. And the poll we're going to launch shortly will basically ask you to rate your organization. Joy mentioned that a lot of organizations kind of fall between a few stages. So we'll ask if you feel like you're falling somewhere between exclusive and passive, between 1 and 2, somewhere between 2 and 3, passive and symbolic change, somewhere between 3 and 4, symbolic change and identity change, between 4 and 5, identity change and structural change, and then finally the last level between 5 and 6, between structural change and fully inclusive. So I know that's a lot too. That's an earful. So I'm going to launch the poll. Is it a good time to launch the poll, Derrick?
Give me just a second. Let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the columns so that people have a better understanding as to how to place themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about column 1 first. Column 1 is an exclusive segregated institution. Now, in the United States today, most institutions are prevented by law from being exclusive. But a couple of things about that. There are organizations that are private organizations that can still be an exclusive segregated institution. We often think about some religious organizations, and golf courses is one that comes up because that's been in the news a fair amount. Another thing to be said about it is that often what we find is that many people of color in institutions might feel like it's an exclusive segregated institution, even if it technically is not. So it is possible that even though we say that most institutions are prevented by law from being exclusive, it's important to note that many people experience their organizations as falling in column 1. A passive or club institution is an institution that is tolerant of a limited number of people of color, and you've read through some of the other columns. So it's an organization that is not exclusive necessarily, but has taken the step to tolerate some amount of diversity with some problematic experiences among people of color and those who are in the institution. Column 3, symbolic change, is where many institutions have moved out of column 2 where they're passive, and they're actually in the process of making some kind of policy and programmatic changes around diversity. Many of us experience organizations that are making an attempt to diversify. Again, it goes back to the blind hiring. How do we get more people of color? How do we diversify the institution? And often institutions feel that reaching column 3 symbolic change is as far as the institution needs to go. And you'll see that that dark line between columns 3 and column 4 represents that. It's very difficult to move from column 3 to column 4. In column 4, you're actually changing the identity of the organization to become an anti-racist institution. And so that line is dark to represent the difficulty in moving beyond symbolic change into an organization that is interested and working on actually changing the identity of the organization into becoming anti-racist. Now, column 5 represents an organization that is involved in actual structural change. This is where audits and different ways of looking at the policies, the procedures, and the programs are in an attempt to actually make the organization beyond the symbolic identity change into actually changing the structures that undergird the entire organization. And it requires a lot of work to do that. And there's a commitment to dismantling racism in the organization at all levels. And that's column 5. Now, column 6, which we call a fully inclusive organization, we don't believe exists in the world today. And part of the reason for that is that subtext under fully inclusive, you'll note, says a transformed institution in a transformed society. So that requires not only our institution to be transformed, but every other institution in all of society to be transformed as well. That is our ultimate goal. We see institutions working towards moving to the right in this continuum, with column 6 being the ultimate goal. So with that, Bridget, we're going to ask you to go ahead and launch the poll and have people let us know where you think your organization lies.
All right, so I just launched the poll. Everyone should be able to see it. Currently in progress. Great, we've got about 20% of votes in. Quickly getting up to 50%. interesting spectrum of answers here too. I'm already seeing, okay, we're at 60% voted. We get those last few in. I'll wrap it up in a few seconds. Okay, we are right around 80%, so I'll wrap up in maybe 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. Okay, here we go. Can you see those, Derrick?
I can see them, yes, very interesting.
Great.
Yeah, and so I would say, it looks like the bulk of people, 43%, actually just about everybody went from column 2 to 3, passive symbolic change, and column 3 and 4, symbolic and change and identity change. This is interesting. It's very representative of the results that we see in organizations all across the country. And part of it has to do with what we said about the goal of or the difficulty in going from symbolic change to identity change. Many of our organizations for the last couple of decades have made a concerted effort to become multicultural without realizing that only gets us to and through symbolic change. And moving from 3 to 4 is very difficult. A couple of other things about that. It's interesting that 43% of you suggested that your organization is somewhere between column 3 and column 4. That's not unusual either because of the difficulty that I discussed in going across that bold line from symbolic change to identity change. And what happens is organizations can spend a lot of time, a lot of effort trying to make that change from column 3 to column 4. Going from symbolic to identity can take a lot of work and a lot of time. Sometimes it's said that it can take up to a decade to move from one column to the next column. And given where our country has been in the last couple of decades, it's not surprising that we see organizations struggling, but making a valiant effort to move from the symbolic to real identity change. And I think this poll represents that struggle. Joy, what would you say about the results in the poll?
Oh yeah, I would agree with you, Derek, in that pretty typical that most of our organizations we work with are somewhere between 2 and 4. And what I would just say about that is that this is like a snapshot. If we ask you today, where is your institution? But it's certainly not static. That what we know is our institutions move back and forth, and it's not always in one direction. So that especially when you're in that column 3 stage, column 3 is very unstable. The symbolic multiculturalism, that we think that when we get a bunch of different folks in the institution, it's going to be all happy and we sing kumbaya and it's going to be beautiful. And what happens is you get different perspectives and different experiences, and you get the gift of conflict and chaos. And staying in stage 3 is unsustainable. You can't stay there for very long. And so what organizations will do if it becomes too challenging and too uncomfortable is they'll move back to 2. Where if you notice the last point on 2, it says we don't have a problem. Column 2 is very comfortable, very clear, very either or, and not ambiguous. And so in some ways, institutions really know how to work column 2, and when things get uncomfortable in 3, we shift back to 2. And taking that leap, as Derek says, over that darker line into 4 is very challenging, and it requires leaning into discomfort. It requires having a different worldview, not just of individuals, but of the whole institution. It requires the institution to say, to get away from saying we're non-racist, and instead to saying we actually have racism as a problem, and we want to do something about it. Anti-racist doesn't mean non-racist. Moving into 4 is the institution is recognizing, wow, we have been shaped by this larger society and the racism that has been built into our systems and institutions.
Yeah, I would also say, and several people, I think 13% put their organization in column 5. Another thing to understand about both columns 4 and column 5 is that once an organization has moved into that place, that it takes a lot of work and intentionality to stay there because organizational history and our culture is always pushing back on the desire to slide back into a column 3 or even a column 2. it is not completely out of the question that an organization can find itself in column 4 and struggling to stay there because personnel can change, circumstances could change, and it could be difficult for an entire institution to remain there. So it takes constant diligence once you get there to maintain that ground, whether you're in column 4 or column 5. There's always pressure to backslide because it can be difficult and a lot of work to maintain that place. Another thing, and Joy, sorry, Joy. I was just going to say that one thing that's interesting is when we do this with institutional groups in our workshops, it's often the case that people of color will place the organization in one column that's much lower than the white folks in the organization. So Joy mentioned that perspectives can be different. Experiences among people of color and white folks in the same organization can be quite different also. And that's one of the reasons that we use this tool. It's an opportunity to assess not only where the organization is, but also where people in the organization perceive it to be. There could be work that needs to be done that is often not seen by the dominant culture within the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing I was going to add too, Derek, when you were saying about the movement back and forth, is that you know, in our poll, we didn't allow you to choose more than just 2 stages, but often when we do this exercise in a face-to-face gathering, we'll have organizations that will put themselves in a span of 2 to 5, for example, and that's really common too, that every institution has a leading edge and a trailing edge. And when you're thinking about how do you then move the whole institution towards column 6, you have to have strategies that engage those who are on the leading edge and make sure they don't get disheartened and disillusioned or say, oh, we've done this before and nothing happens. That you have strategies to keep them engaged and keep them leading. But you also have to have strategies for those on the trailing edge in column 2 or 3 or wherever the trailing edge is, especially in column 2, if they're saying we don't have a problem, then how do you help them become dissatisfied with the status quo and to see that, wow, where we're at actually isn't working for all of us and we need to make some change. So that's the kind of thing that we at Chicago Roar will help institutions to do, is think about, first of all, how do you assess your institution in a critical, loving kind of way where you're honest and critical about where you are, not because you want to just beat yourselves up or complain all the time, but because you actually want to have a good starting point to know then how do we move towards our actual goals. And once you have that assessment, then what are the strategies that you can put in place to help bring about change and movement?
And we actually have a few questions coming in around the continuum movement. I'd love to raise if we have some time. One person asked, they say that it seems like moving from 3 to 4 requires more dependence on common spiritual grounding. Do you feel like that's accurate, or how have you seen that movement happen in your experience working with organizations?
I would say that's absolutely correct. When I was talking about spiritual practice earlier in terms of sustaining the work, this is often where that becomes very important because of the turmoil that's involved and the change that's involved. You know, in our experience, all change is experienced as loss, and that can create a great amount of stress not only on the organization but on the individuals. In Chicago Roar, we spend a lot of energy around caucusing and different types of spiritual practices to maintain our humanity while we're trying to do this work, because it's not uncommon for individuals to have all kinds of conflict with each other while this turmoil is taking place. So some kind of spiritual practice to sustain the work becomes very important place in the continuum in an organization.
Yeah, I would also say that community organizing and power analysis is huge in 3 to 4, because that's where you start. People already are starting to know this isn't working. The dissatisfaction is pretty clear in column 3, and so then people are wanting to know why, and that's where a power analysis can help folks understand what's going on and how we're all caught up in this and how we're all complicit. And then you also are gathering more and more folks into a shared understanding that then helps you move into column 4.
That's great. And I see a few more questions coming in here that I'll try to raise quickly because I know we have about 15 minutes left and there's some more to go in here. One is, I feel that we are in kind of the number 5 category and committed to structural change, but the gap between that commitment and full inclusivity seems so large and feels so far in the future. So how can we close that gap effectively?
Well, one thing that I would say about closing that gap is recognizing that the key part of fully inclusive is that transformed society. And what we say about that is that's if an organization is in column 5, then the first thing that needs to happen is a lot of intentionality and work around staying in column 5, which means hiring the kind of people, instituting the kind of practices that can sustain whatever it took to get to column 5. And that can take a lot of time and a lot of energy in and of itself. But in order to become column 6, for that fully transformed society, what it means is that every other organization needs to be fully transformed. Wow. So if your organization is in a column 5, then it's time to think about what organizations that are you in relationship with? What other organizations do you depend on? Where are your constituents? And how do you use the values that you gain to put yourself in column 5 and share those to help influence other organizations and institutions in society? So for instance, if you are part of an organization that has a parent organization and you've determined that your part of the organization is in column 5, but the parent organization, for instance, is in column 4, then how do you use your learnings, what you've gained, to help the broader organization move into column 5 with you? And how do you get other organizations that you're in relationship to adopt the kind of practices that have secured you in column 5? And how do you share that so that other organizations can get there? Because column 6 requires us all to move from column 5 to column 6 together. In order for that to happen, all organizations have to move across from 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and 4 to 5 to be there with us. And then the idea is that we can all make that leap into column 6. But we don't want to discount the amount of intentionality that it requires to maintain a position in column 5. And also, does it mean that everybody in your organization is experiencing the organization as being in column 5? There may be some work to be done to even determine whether that is true for everyone or not.
Another question I see here is, how does this translate to organizations that are led or run by people of color?
That's a really good question, and actually at Crossroads we do have another continuum that we use for organizations of color that is very similar, but especially the first 2 columns are slightly different. And if there's any organizations of color on the call, we could talk with you about having a conversation about sharing that continuum. But basically, when we say organizations of color, we mean organizations that were started by and for people of color, often because the mainstream institutions were exclusively for white people or somehow advantageously for white people. And so that's the difference. There are lots of institutions that we would call white institutions that have lots of people of color, even in leadership, but they were founded by and started by white people and often for white people. But you're absolutely right in that especially the first couple stages are are different. But what we know is that even organizations of color, whether it's tribal governments or organizations like the NAACP or La Raza or any organizations that are set up by and for people of color, they are influenced by the larger society and often end up internalizing some of the white dominant cultural ways of being. And in order to interact in the society, in order to survive, they're bumping up against those ways of being. So they are certainly impacted as well.
Right. And one more question. Is it okay if I raise one more, or should I wait and see if we have more time at the end?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think this is the last one, at least for now. But please keep sending them in if you have more. How would you evaluate someone's feelings about diversity when interviewing new potential staff members?
Could you repeat the question, Bridget, please?
Yes. How would you evaluate someone's feelings about diversity when interviewing new potential staff members?
Well, I think there's lots of different kinds of questions that you could ask that have people, asking people's understanding about how do they think about power? How do they think about diversity? Do they think of it as an asset? Do they think of it as a deficit? You can ask questions about how folks have been in interactions with other people and how they've handled those situations. I think there's a lot of different kinds of ways where you can get at that. But what I think is also important is to assess whether people are willing and open to learn and to continue to grow, and also to acknowledge their own biases. That to me says somebody's further along if they can say, yes, I do have biases, and I know that that's part of how we're socialized, and I'm committed to working on them. That is a better place to be that will help you move into four than someone who's saying, no, I don't have any biases anymore, or that kind of thing. And so how do you ask questions where you leave room, especially in an interview process where you're trying to get the right answer? How do you have some kinds of conversation where there's some encouragement or willingness for folks to be honest in that way?
And I would add one question I like to ask that gets at that is just talk to me about your history around diversity and racism and see what they say. Do they use words like anti-racism? Have they said that they were frustrated by the desire for diversity but not moving beyond that? What is their experience around it? I would want to include where they've actually been and what they've actually done, not necessarily as a litmus test, but to understand how they think about these things beyond giving the right answer to a question. What has your experience around these topics been? I think that can be I think that can go a long way towards helping you understand how they actually feel about these things, or perhaps whether they've had any experience around it or not. I think not having experience is not uncommon in a society that is encouraged not to address these things at all. So it depends on a lot of factors, what level the position is, what the expectation is. But I think asking the kind of questions that talk about their history and experience with these topics and their perspective about it, rather than looking for hard answers, could be helpful.
Yeah. In many of the organizations we work with, in their onboarding processes, they will include a requirement of doing some kind of anti-racism training, just as they would around sexual harassment or whatever else it is that's required when you get the job. Some people will implement that, and then folks who are applying know that that's a requirement of your organization and something you value. But I would also just say, too, that we want to be careful when we're thinking about institutional change to not only stay at the personnel level. That's one of the more outer levels or layers of our institutions, and it's often where we go when we think about how do we make change. And yet we also need to go a little bit deeper into the programs and into how are you setting up your constituency, who are you accountable to, what kinds of practices and policies and procedures are in place, and ultimately what is your mission. That we want to get into some of those deeper inner layers of the institution, as well as looking at personnel. But if we only focus at personnel, we get that revolving door that Derrick was talking about, people of color coming in because there's a stated commitment to diversity and multicultural inclusion, and yet when we come in, the institution is operating just as it's symbolic change. There's nothing really has changed at deeper levels.
And another problem with that, if we're focusing our energy on personnel and hiring, then another danger in that is that we're led to make assumptions. So we're led to make assumptions that people of color, for instance, have a history of working with anti-racism and white folks do not, and that's not necessarily the case. So we want to be very careful about understanding that, and also understanding what it means to hire one person in a department or organization that is not thinking about these things long term, as Joy talked about. So it's an important part of the picture, but we have to be very careful about how much importance we put on who we hire in that regard.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to move it to the next slide that just gives a few things that we call organizing principles. And these are just 7 things to keep in mind. We're going to just touch on them briefly and then move it to some final closing comments. Derrick, do you want to start with the first one?
Sure. The first one is the task is organizing for systemic change. And often when we talk about this, people get concerned about the word organizing. People say, well, I'm not an organizer. I don't know about organizing. And really what we're talking about is not any particular type of organizing, but it just means gathering our resources, as we talked about earlier, and moving in that direction. All of the types of things that are in the continuum, the different types of work that we might do. But what we're looking for is systemic change. Again, not just around hiring the right kind of people or hiring people of color, but how do we hire, for instance, for people who understand strategy and understand power and those types of things? Because what we want is systemic change over the long term, not just that kind of symbolic change that we saw in column 3.
Yeah, and the second one is that we want the organizing task then is to develop an anti-racist institutional identity. How does the institution claim that we are anti-racist? This is part of who we are. This is our history, and we're not going to deny it or defend it. But this is how we've come to be, and this is where we see some gaps. And this is how we're going to go about changing it, and we're committed to this. And this is cultural shift, and I think that's not always as easy as nonprofits when our funders are looking for quantifiable data for change. It can be a challenge sometimes to put those into numbers or into quick fixes or programs. And this is why it also is long-term work, because we're talking about, we know how hard it is to change our own personal identities and to be transformed as individuals, but then as an institution as well. And yet that is what we would suggest is required.
The organizing task is an inside job. What we mean by this is that we at Chicago Roar believe that institutions are very important. We are not anti-institution. We are clear that institutions create, manage, and distribute the resources that we all need to do life. And we are part of those institutions, and presumably we care a great deal about those institutions. So as a person who's inside, who cares about the organization, what can I do to organize the institution into being better, being that anti-racist, multicultural institution? If my organization has a mission and a goal and a vision as to how we want to be in the world, how do we close the gap between who we say we are and how we behave? As an insider in the organization who knows the organization intimately, how do I build the kind of relationships and understand the kind of influence I need as someone inside of the organization to organize for systemic long-term change?
And we would say that a specific model of change is needed for each institution, that there's no blueprints or this is the way everybody does it. Each institution is unique. And so while we have learned some things over the years about what are some helpful things and unhelpful things, we also know that each institution has to take its own journey and customize the path that they're taking. And so that's part of what we do as Chicago Roar as well, is we walk alongside of organizations. We don't see ourselves as vendors that come in and do a workshop and then leave, but rather partners in this long-term organizing journey, helping you figure out what are the steps to take along the way. And when you take a step one direction and figure out, oh, that didn't work, then how do we regroup and go another direction? And to take that, it's more of an organic process that we make the journey as we're walking. There's not a whole lot of institutions in column 5 or 6, and so we want to be learning together as we move toward those columns.
Trained, equipped leadership teams are needed to create the kind of systemic change that we're looking for. Chicago Roar's job is to build internal transformation teams who know the institution and understand the history, the structure, the mission, and the goals in order to make that kind of change. So what we do is train and equip those teams to do that. How do we look at budgets? How do we understand how power plays out? And also, one of the reasons teams are important is it goes back to that spiritual practice that we talked about. One thing that we know is that this work cannot be done by a person in an institution as an individual. It requires people not only at all levels of the organization, from the executive director or the president to the people who do custodial work, to the secretaries, to the program managers. All of those people from different perspectives inside of the institution need to understand how to do this work and how to make this change. Training is required. Being equipped, how do we gather the resources that we need? How do we make sure that this work is funded by a line item in the budget so that the next time the executive director changes, the work doesn't go away because the new executive director doesn't believe in doing anti-racism work? Our job at Chicago Roar is to actually do that training, equip those people inside the institution, how to build a team, how to sustain the team, and how can that team be most effective given the context of that particular institution.
Mm-hmm. And as we've said several times, that we see this work as being long-term, even generational. And so we often work with our teams to come up with 20 to 30-year visions. And that doesn't mean we just say, okay, people, hold your breath while we wait that long, because there are some actions we can take even now and in the short term on our way to long-term change. And finally, one more thing before we close.
Yeah, finally, institutional change is a component of community change. All of us who have done any kind of community organizing or know anything about it know that the purpose for community organizing is to change communities for the better. Those communities are made up of institutions, and what we know is none of those institutions work in isolation. We are all connected, not only as individuals, but by the institutions that we serve and that serve us. So in order to make the kind of sustainable change in communities that we want to change, we are very clear that institutional change has to be a part of that. And Chicago Roar's mission, job, and goal is to focus on institutional change. How do we help institutions become anti-racist, multicultural institutions, and how can those institutions influence other institutions so that the community can see positive change in this regard?
Great. Well, that is all that we wanted to share with you, and I know that it is about that time, and so if folks have to jump off, that we totally understand. If there are any final comments, we're willing to take those before we close.
Yeah, I wanted to add, so we're going to be sending out the recording and the slides to this webinar to everyone who's registered, so that includes all of you. And we're also going to send information about a 2-day session with Chicago Roar that's open to all the organizations attending today. And Joy and Derrick are so fantastic at what they do. And I think any organization that's really serious about their commitment to becoming an anti-racist, multicultural organization could really benefit from working with them and hiring them to work with your organization in some capacity. So I really recommend looking into that. And I think one of the best pieces of advice that I've heard in talking to a lot of people who are much wiser than I about diversity and inclusion, particularly for predominantly white orgs, is that there's time if it's in your values. And so if it is something that your organization really values and is interested in making a big part of what you do, putting time behind it, putting resources into it, I think is definitely worth doing. So thank you again to Joy and Derrick for being here with us. And everyone just look out for the resources coming to you shortly, either today or tomorrow.
Bridget, thank you very much for inviting us. It's good to be with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.